Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about a pretty heavy topic, one which I mentioned previously in a separate video a few days ago. We looked at a report from Al Jazeera about actions allegedly carried out by IDF soldiers against Palestinian prisoners or hostages. The semantics around that depends on who's reporting. This topic is extremely heavy, and it reveals a level of brutality and cruelty that has been perpetuated during this war between Israel and Gaza, which has now extended into southern Lebanon as well. Just a few days ago, it was reported that Israeli forces allegedly blew up a school run by nuns in Lebanon. Anyway, this new report published by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times details allegations of severe sexual abuse carried out against Palestinian detainees. According to the article, many of these victims were warned not to speak publicly about what they endured. Some were allegedly told they would be killed or raped again if they gave interviews, yet they still found the courage to come forward. One man described being raped 3 separate times in a single day inside an Israeli prison, with a third assault allegedly occurring after he attempted to protest. A young woman said guards would come in at the beginning of each shift, strip her naked, and abuse her. Another woman reported that she was shown photos of herself allegedly being assaulted and warned that the images would be released unless she cooperated with Israeli intelligence. Even 3 children who had been detained told Kristof they had been sexually abused. Now, this report includes allegations that, as I mentioned a moment ago, we covered in a previous video. On one occasion, a man was reportedly held down, stripped naked, blindfolded, and handcuffed. A dog was allegedly summoned, and with encouragement from a handler speaking Hebrew, the dog mounted him while others took photos and laughed. According to the account, the abuse escalated into the unthinkable. Now, needless to say, these allegations deserve the highest level of condemnation from every level of society, from the media to our leaders in government, enabling, facilitating, funding, and arming this genocidal campaign. I don't know any other way to describe it. I've received pushback from people in my own party for referring to the IDF as a genocidal force, but this goes beyond just accusations of genocide. These allegations describe true acts of terror, of humiliation, of cruelty at a level that is deeply disturbing. And honestly, I hate using the phrase, words can't describe it, because we need words in order to communicate these things, these actions clearly. It is in the interest of Americans to know exactly what our tax dollars are funding and enabling in this conflict. And obviously, as we'll see in a moment, there has already been pushback from the Israeli government and many of its allies. Some are framing these accusations as some sort of blood libel. Others are calling this an anti-Semitic lie. It's the same playbook we've seen repeatedly whenever criticism of Israel and Israeli military emerges. But needless to say, these actions should be condemned from every side. This is not about targeting an ethnicity or a religious group. This is about condemning acts of cruelty, acts of terror and abuse that would be unacceptable no matter who committed them. And as I said, as Americans, we should at the very least be made aware of these actions, because our tax dollars are being used to provide extensive military support and political cover for the Israeli state as they perpetuate these war crimes. Accountability and scrutiny is the bare minimum that Americans should be afforded in this situation. Now, as I mentioned, there is already pushback from Israel and their allies. The Israeli Foreign Ministry posted on X stating, today, the New York Times chose to publish one of the worst blood libels ever to appear in the modern press, in an unfathomable inversion of reality and through an endless stream of baseless lies. Propagandist Nicholas Kristof turns the victim into the accused. Israel, whose citizens were victims of horrific sexual crimes committed by Hamas on October 7th and whose hostages were later subjected to further sexual abuse, is portrayed as a guilty party. This publication is no coincidence. It is part of a false and well-orchestrated anti-Israel campaign aimed at placing Israel on the United Nations Secretary General's blacklist. Israel will fight these lies with the truth, and the truth will prevail. Now, notably, the Israeli Foreign Ministry appears to engage in a form of moral equivalence and appeal to victimhood here, implying that because Israelis suffered the horrific atrocities on October 7th, Israel itself would somehow be incapable of committing or enabling similar acts of cruelty. In other words, they are invoking the suffering of October 7th as a shield against the allegations being presented rather than directly addressing the substance of those allegations in Kristof's piece. Now, there is also arguably a genetic fallacy being injected into the response where the focus shifts away from whether the claims are true and instead toward attacking the alleged motives behind the publication itself. The statement claims the New York Times article is part of a coordinated anti-Israel campaign intended to place Israel on a United Nations blacklist, effectively framing the report as politically motivated rather than engaging with the actual evidence and testimony presented. And look, just in realistic terms here for a second, we all know that the United Nations is largely ineffective when it comes to enforcing meaningful consequences in any sort of way. The real battle here is over public perception in the United States. But obviously, that's not something that the Israeli government would usually want to state openly. But that's not where their response ended. Israel War Room, an Israeli government-affiliated social media account, responded by attacking, ironically, many of the very people Nicholas Kristof interviewed. They went through several of the individuals mentioned in the report and attempted to discredit them one by one. They claimed this was Hamas propaganda, attacked organizations like Save the Children, argued that some interviewees were anti-Israel activists, alleged further links to Hamas, and claimed some of these organizations exist solely to demonize, slander, and harm Israel. Needless to say, what seems notably absent from the Israel War Room response is any actual evidence disproving the allegations reported by Kristof. Much of the response instead focused on labeling the sources as anti-Israel, Hamas-linked, or radical in an attempt to undermine their credibility rather than directly refuting the substance of the claims themselves. Dropsite News responded to Israel War Room's post by pushing back against what they described as a baseless smear campaign against the victims and witnesses cited in the article. They made similar criticisms to what we just noted that Israel War Room repeatedly did, that being labeling the victims with various politically motivated labels in order to discredit the New York Times reporting, while also omitting many of the sources referenced in Kristof's piece. And notably, those sources included the United Nations, a former Israeli prime minister, and an Israeli-American human rights lawyer. Wonder why they didn't mention any of that. And by the way, this report did not just come out of nowhere. These allegations are actually not entirely new. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we looked at a report from Al Jazeera just a few days ago that presented many of the same claims and testimonies. Additionally, Owen Jones published a similar report back on April 23rd. So this is part of a broader and ongoing body of reporting surrounding allegations against Palestinian detainees by the IDF during this conflict. That said, the pushback by Israel and their allies to the New York Times report is also causing growing backlash. And part of that backlash involves a video currently being circulated online that allegedly appears to show Israelis protesting in defense of what critics are describing as the right to rape. Now, obviously, this footage is being widely shared online without context. I personally tried to look into it to verify both the authenticity of the footage and the broader story surrounding it, but I was unable to find much beyond reposts, captions, and people recirculating the clip across social media with little context. So obviously, we have to approach this with caution and take it at face value unless further verification emerges. But nonetheless, this is one of the videos currently resurfacing online as part of the broader backlash and discourse surrounding these allegations in Kristof's report, which, to be fair, is also being paired with verified footage that reportedly shows IDF soldiers sexually abusing Palestinian detainees. That video itself has been widely reported on by mainstream media outlets and has been treated as authentic in multiple news reports. And the timing of all of this makes the situation even more interesting when you take into account that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently appeared in a 60 Minutes interview that is now being heavily scrutinized, not just because of Netanyahu's statements, but because 60 Minutes did what they do best. They deceptively edited the interview, which really doesn't come as a surprise considering who is currently running CBS News, one of those people being Barry Weiss, the ultra-Zionist Barry Weiss, who also runs the Free Press. The same Free Press, by the way, which has previously published hit pieces on yours truly, largely because I've been openly critical of the Israeli state. Anyway, here are some of the clips currently being shared from this Netanyahu interview, as well as some of the deceptive editing. We're going to look at that in a moment.
Anti-Semitism, this vile vilification of the Jews, took a reprieve after the Holocaust. Took a reprieve. Took 80 years. It wasn't fashionable to be anti-Semitic, so you didn't say these things in polite society. But it's come back. It's almost like it accompanies us throughout.
What is that about, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think
because I want to stop you right there, because in my career, which started in 1990 in Washington, up until very recently, it was an established fact in Congress. Established fact. The Republicans and Democrats had a default proposition favorable to Israel. Not always, not universally, but a default proposition that began with yes. That's not true anymore. That's less true than at any other time I've covered Washington. That has to be reflective of something else.
Yes, it is. Well, these are historical cycles.
Oh,
which
so
my
you're in a
father,
historical cycle.
Yes, we are. I mean, anti-Semitism is...
It had been flowed, yes.
Yeah, it had been flowed, but it flowed throughout our history. And the reason it,
But America's not a place where things like that tend to come back.
Well, they can come back. They were there in the 1930s
yes.
with Father Coughlin, and they ebbed because of the war, but it's come back. What is it? I think it's an interesting question of why this happens, and I think there's a natural human tendency between people and also between peoples, collective groups. It's called jealousy, and jealousy often, if somebody is very successful, you can be appreciative of them, especially if it's, say, a very successful and strong country. Then you temper your jealousy and you go to respect.
What?
But if you...
So these are the embers of envy.
America is envious of Israel? What are you talking about, brother?
I think one thing I can say is that there are many explanations for the phenomenon, the durability of anti-Semitism over the ages. My father was a great historian of this, and we can have a separate discussion on it.
This has to be one of the most arrogant responses to criticism of the Israeli state that I've seen in a minute, okay? Now, there are really two major things happening here. And by the way, Netanyahu's response completely avoids the actual reason public opinion on Israel has fractured so dramatically in the United States in the past few years. Now, first, Netanyahu attempts to frame criticism of Israel as part of some broader historical hatred, envy, or irrational obsession with the Jewish state. That is an absolute red herring. Anybody honestly looking at what has unfolded since the start of this war in Gaza understands that the primary driver behind the collapse of support for Israel among large portions of the American public has been the actions of the Israeli state itself in Gaza and now increasingly in southern Lebanon. Americans have spent the last 2 to 2.5 years opening social media apps like TikTok, X, Instagram, and Telegram and watching this conflict unfold in real time directly on their phones. We've seen the bombings. We've seen the flattened neighborhoods, the dead civilians, the starving children, the maimed children, the mass displacement, the footage of destruction that critics, including organizations within the United Nations, have described using terms like ethnic cleansing and genocide, indiscriminate bombing. Now, whether people agree with those labels or not, the point is that this is what shifted public opinion about Israel in America. It was not some sudden outbreak of jealousy toward Israel. It wasn't some sudden outbreak of anti-Semitism that rebirthed in America against Israel that just caught millions in this brain virus. It was quite literally the result of millions of people witnessing the war with their own eyes outside the control of traditional media gatekeepers. See, for decades, legacy media institutions largely controlled the framing of foreign conflicts, but now the average person can compare official government statements against raw footage, civilian testimony, independent journalists, and influencers and viral videos circulating online in real time. Once people begin noticing contradictions between official narratives and what they are directly witnessing themselves on their phones, trust collapses very quickly. So it came as no surprise to anyone when pro-Israel Zionist billionaires moved aggressively to regain control over media narratives in America by buying platforms like TikTok, CBS, CNN, as part of a broader attempt to rehabilitate Israel's image with the American public and suppress the flood of negative publicity surrounding the war and Israel's actions. From the Ellisons to the Edelsons, most Americans now are convinced that legacy media institutions are functioning less as objective news organizations and more as narrative laundry services, operations of sorts, to steer public perception back toward a pro-Israel consensus within America. But the skepticism the American public has toward Israel isn't going anywhere, folks. Look, we grew up being taught in schools, churches, in our textbooks, and media throughout our lives that Israel is our greatest ally, that Israel is so great. From the Schofield Bible in evangelical churches to McGraw-Hill textbooks in our schools, we grew up in an environment where we were literally conditioned to be pro-Israel, and now many people are in real time re-examining assumptions they previously accepted about Israel without question. Even in my own case, watching this conflict unfold in the past few years pushed me to independently study the history of the region, revisit aspects of my own Catholic tradition and how it sees the state of Israel, as well as the historic conflict happening in that area, helping me root my criticism of the Israeli state and their actions in the region against their neighbors in a more principled, historically informed stance than I previously held. That process is not just happening for me, it's happening for millions of people across the world and in America, as well as younger generations who are no longer beholden to mainstream institutions or even academic institutions in order to tell them what they should think about this foreign nation. Now, all that being said, the second part of Netanyahu's framing is what truly pushes this entire statement into absurd territory. Netanyahu essentially claims that the backlash against Israel is rooted in envy or jealousy, as he says, that the world, and I guess particularly Americans, are jealous of Israel. What are you talking about, brother? Seriously. Is that honestly the argument that you're trying to make here? That Americans are watching 2 years of bombings, allegations of war crimes, civilian deaths, regional escalation in Iran and Lebanon, and a complete humanitarian collapse, rape allegations, as we saw earlier, some of the highest levels of cruelty that has been reported in American media in years. And with all of that, the real explanation for declining support for Israel is simply jealousy. That framing is so detached from reality that it almost feels insulting to the intelligence of anybody who had to just sit through this. The erosion of support for Israel in America did not happen in a vacuum, and it did not happen because Americans suddenly feel jealous of Israel. It happened because millions of people spent the last 2 years watching horrifying footage emerge from Gaza every single day and came to conclusions based on what they saw themselves. Even many previously neutral Americans, like myself, started independently researching the history of the conflict because of the scale of destruction, which became almost impossible to ignore. And by the way, the irony of trying to float this argument is absolutely unbelievable. The wealthiest, most prosperous, and powerful nation in human history, the United States, a continental superpower, stretching from sea to shining sea, is supposedly jealous of a country the size of New Jersey, a country whose existence depends almost entirely on American military aid, diplomatic protection, and financial support in order to sustain itself and continue engaging in relentless war throughout that region? How can you claim that with a straight face when the Israeli state is highly dependent, some would even say parasitic, in its relationship with the United States as they pursue what many have described as an increasingly expansionist and militaristic agenda against its neighbors? Now, whether one agrees or not with that characterization, the idea that America is somehow jealous of Israel is just an astonishingly arrogant political message, especially if you're trying to win over ordinary Americans. The same Americans who are funding your state and your wars, by the way, and are struggling with inflation, housing costs, healthcare costs, economic instability, while watching billions of our dollars being funneled into your nation so you can literally mutilate children. And that's why your messaging is failing, bro. Instead of acknowledging why public opinion has shifted, instead of recognizing that people are reacting to what they have directly witnessed for the better part of 2.5 years, the response from Netanyahu is essentially, no, you don't get us. You guys are jealous. I genuinely don't think this is going to resonate with Americans the way that you think it's going to.
Again, you can say anything because it's this. This is yours, right?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of,
you're not immune either, because you can penetrate this machine, you can penetrate this little instrument, and you can say about Major Garrett anything you want, and I can paint you as a monster. And if I say it often enough people will believe it. I am not bemoaning this. I'm stating this
you
as a
clearly
fact.
are.
Israel is besieged on the media front, on the propaganda front, and we've not done well on the propaganda war. We have to fight back against these lies, this propaganda, with the only weapon we have. It's the truth. I'm trying to do that now, and we'll try to do that in a much greater effort.
Once again, irony is a cruel mistress. So the irony of Netanyahu making these kinds of statements while there are widespread reports from the Times of Israel about Israel and pro-Israel organizations pouring hundreds of millions, in some cases, some are reporting even billions of dollars into influencing American public opinion, which is honestly incredible. And the craziest part is that he appears to be saying this completely unironically. At a certain point, you almost have to wonder whether this is meant to be an SNL sketch. Because look, these guys, they're not even trying to hide it anymore, okay? You have examples like Ronald Lauder, president of the World Jewish Congress, who was announcing on camera, openly admitting that his organization spent roughly $600 million on PR campaigns after October 7th in an effort to shape public perception surrounding Israel and the war. And despite all of that spending, despite the media campaigns, despite the messaging blitz, despite the influence operations, public opinion still continues to move against them. And you got to wonder why.
Since October 7, all Jewish organizations in the United States together have spent upwards of $600 million fighting this avalanche of anti-Semitism. I have one question. Has it helped? Has all this money stopped or even slowed down the hatred against us? The answer is no. All the efforts from TV commercials to full-page ads and newspapers, conferences, all the attempts to tell the world the facts have accomplished very little. That's because anti-Semites already have access to all the facts, and they're not interested in the facts or truth. They have their own psychotic narrative that blames Jews for everything under the sun.
It is extraordinary that Ronald Lauder, the same Ronald Lauder, by the way, who was reportedly mentioned hundreds of times in the Jeffrey Epstein-related files released in early 2026, is now out here openly laying this framework for the public while simultaneously labeling virtually all criticism of the Israeli state as some form of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. You can only stretch that accusation so far before it completely loses all meaning, okay? At this point, calling anybody an anti-Semite has, in most instances, become about as ineffective and overused as modern leftists calling anybody they disagree with a Nazi. The label has been expanded and diluted to such an extreme degree that for most ordinary folks, it barely carries any meaning anymore. And by the way, this phenomenon of stretching the anti-Semitism accusation to no end is nothing new. As we discussed a few weeks ago, even G.K. Chesterton was talking about this exact issue back in the early 20th century. Chesterton warned that the term anti-Semitism was increasingly being broadened to encompass virtually anybody who criticized the actions of Zionists and the Israeli political project, to the point where the accusation itself risks becoming meaningless. And that is exactly what is happening today. The usefulness of this language, politically speaking, is not really about engaging with criticism substantively, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. It is about shutting down debate, intimidating people into silence, and pathologizing critics of the Israeli state as irrational, hateful, mentally unstable, or morally defective. The implication becomes that if you are criticizing Israel or any of their allies, you must be driven by some deep psychological or ideological sickness rather than responding to actual political, military, actions taken by that state. In other words, the accusation itself becomes a tool to derail the conversation before it can even happen. It shifts the debate away from the substance of the criticism, and it traps the entire discussion in endless arguments over labels, motives, and moral accusations instead of addressing the underlying issue directly. But the reality is that this strategy is not going to make this criticism disappear. It simply will not. If defenders of the Israeli state actually wanted to persuade skeptical people, they would focus on debating the substance of the criticism itself. They would acknowledge that many of the actions carried out by the IDF have generated widespread international outrage, and that numerous incidents have been described by papers like the New York Times, by international observers, by human rights groups as war crimes, including the United Nations, by the way. They would at least concede that serious abuses have occurred and demonstrate a genuine willingness to hold people accountable where wrongdoing took place. Instead, what we've seen is the exact opposite. In several highly publicized cases involving allegations of abuse and rape by IDF soldiers against Palestinian detainees, reports emerged that charges were dropped or soldiers were cleared without meaningful accountability. Whether one agrees with every allegation or not, the perception created by this pattern is absolutely devastating. If there were a visible effort to seriously investigate abuses and punish wrongdoing, I think many people would be far more willing to engage in honest debate and nuanced discussion about the conflict. All that said, it's never been more evident that this isn't even about accountability or truth at all. This appears to be about protecting and upholding a brutal, cruel, and terroristic government that is growing increasingly radical as it pursues what many have alleged to be an expansionist and genocidal political agenda extending far beyond Gaza itself, perhaps from the Euphrates to the Nile. Now, all that being said, that interview with Netanyahu also raised a lot of eyebrows because it appears to have been edited deceptively, and Megyn Kelly was one of the first people to report on this.
That basically manipulated social media with bot farms, with fake addresses to break the American sympathy to Israel, to break the American-Israeli alliance because they think it's in their interests. And they do it in a clever way. You know, it's like you hear a text message. I'm a red-blooded Texan. I always supported Israel, but I can't stand what they're doing. I'm turning against Israel. And then you trace the address to some basement in Pakistan, you know. And that's something that has hurt us badly.
So that whole thing about bot farms did not air. Okay, the version that aired on TV included some of what we just played, but it was combined with a section from the very end of the interview, which focused on Israel's tactics to respond to the sentiment shift, not the shift itself. All right, they let him get away with it's all social media. It's not Israel's behavior. It has nothing to do with those tens of thousands dead in Gaza, or Gaza looking like a parking lot now.
Now, needless to say, that kind of deflection is not going to convince Americans to suddenly change their minds. At this point, Netanyahu genuinely comes across like somebody politically fighting for his life. And honestly, from a public relations standpoint, you couldn't ask for a worse optical disaster than this interview. And look, we only looked at a couple of clips. There are many more moments from that interview that are just equally bad, if not worse, in terms of optics and messaging. And this is what makes the entire situation just so bizarre. If Israel and pro-Israel organizations are spending the kind of money people claim they are spending to influence American politics, media narratives, and just overall American public opinion about the Israeli state and its actions in the region, these guys are doing an awful job. They really are. This is probably one of the worst narratives you could possibly run with at a moment when American public opinion of Israel is already collapsing. Wouldn't you at least want to spend a couple of dollars on polling or focus groups to figure out how Americans actually want to receive a message before lecturing Americans about what they are supposed to believe? Seriously. Since when have Americans ever responded positively to being told what they should think? If anything, one of the defining characteristics of Americans culturally is that the faster you try to force a narrative down our throats, the more likely we are to reject it purely out of spite. That's just part of the American temperament. Americans historically do not like being dictated to, managed, propagandized, or morally bullied into compliance. And honestly, if there is one thing that most Americans fundamentally repudiate, It is being told what to think or how they are morally obligated to interpret the reality, the objective reality they're being presented before their eyes, especially when that reality is a maimed child in Gaza. And look, to be fair, I don't even think that's uniquely American. I think most people around the world, if given the choice, do not want to be psychologically cornered into accepting a narrative by rogue governments, by bought out media institutions, by dishonest actors and activists and political organizations with the goal of just justifying the actions of a terroristic state. That approach will always backfire, perhaps not initially if they get lucky, but eventually it will. Now, following the publication of that New York Times report by Nicholas Kristof, which we started the video with, another report has also begun circulating widely online. This comes from B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization operating in the occupied territories. In statements posted on X and in their published findings, B'Tselem claims that Israel is effectively operating what they describe as a network of torture camps for Palestinians. Their report, titled Welcome to Hell and Hell on Earth, extensively documents what they describe as a system of extreme violence, starvation, humiliation, and torture inside Israeli detention facilities. According to the report, Palestinian detainees are subjected to severe physical violence, deliberate humiliation, starvation, sleep deprivation, denial of medical care, and various forms of abuse across virtually every facility where they are held. The report further claims that at least 88 Palestinians have died in Israeli detention facilities since October 2023 as a result of the conditions we just described. Now, what makes this particularly significant is that B'Tselem does not frame these incidents as isolated misconduct by individual guards or rogue soldiers. They argue that these abuses are systemic and fully backed, tolerated, or even in some cases enabled by Israeli political leadership itself. And beyond that, they raise a broader accusation against the international community, arguing that Western governments and international institutions continue standing by while allowing Israel to commit these sorts of crimes against the Palestinian people without meaningful consequences or accountability. And look, as I mentioned earlier, this is particularly important for Americans to understand because the United States is not some neutral observer in this conflict. American tax dollars are directly funding the Israeli state. American weapons systems are helping sustain Israel's military operations, and American diplomatic and military support continues providing international cover for Israel's actions throughout the region. And without that support, many of these operations simply cannot continue at their current scale. But as always, a counter-narrative immediately follows. The very next day after Kristof's article was published, that being today, a new report was published in the Daily Mail describing what it called the full depravity of Hamas during October 7th, revealed for the first time. Now, the report detailed what it described as almost unimaginable atrocities committed against Israeli families during the attacks. Now, needless to say, the report is horrific. The details being described are deeply disturbing. And as we're going to discuss in a moment, there are questions around these allegations. But look, one atrocity does not excuse another atrocity. Both deserve equal scrutiny. And just because one side is considered America's so-called greatest ally does not suddenly mean that that greatest ally should be exempt from criticism, accountability, or the same moral standards when allegations of similar abuses emerge on their side. That's ultimately the core issue here. The standard cannot simply become when atrocities happen to Israelis, they receive wall-to-wall coverage, outrage, and global sympathy. But when atrocities are committed against Palestinians over the course of years, involving dozens, in some cases hundreds of victims, those stories are minimized, dismissed, or buried beneath accusations of anti-Semitism and propaganda. Many of the Palestinian victims being discussed in these reports do not receive anywhere near the same level of international attention, media sympathy, or political concern that Israelis receive from Western governments and our media institutions. And that imbalance is exactly why it's important to keep discussing these stories. Now, all that being said, there are also questions being raised about both the timing of the Daily Mail report and the background of the author of the Daily Mail report. Max Blumenthal pointed this out on X, where he described the article as fake and accused the author, Natalie Lisbona, of being what he called an Israeli asset. According to Blumenthal, Lisbona previously promoted discredited October 7th claims involving allegations that Palestinians burned babies and ripped fetuses from pregnant women, while allegedly citing witnesses who, according to him, did not actually exist. Blumenthal also shared a photo of Lisbona alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu taken in 2022, which he used to further question her neutrality and credibility in reporting on the conflict. Now, the veracity of some of these claims is also being heavily scrutinized online. Many people have been sharing screenshots from a 2024 article from The Gray Zone titled "Israeli Propagandists Behind Hamas Mass Rape Narrative Exposing Grifter Fraud Scandal." The article focuses on Kochav Elchaim Levy, a Israeli lawyer who became one of the central figures promoting allegations of systemic sexual violence by Hamas during the October 7th attacks. Now, according to Gray Zone's reporting, Elchaim Levy was accused by Israeli media outlets of misleading donors and spreading misinformation connected to some of those claims. The allegations reportedly surfaced just days after she received a prestigious Israeli award, which only intensifies scrutiny surrounding both her credibility and the broader narrative. Now, all that being said, it's no surprise that rabid Zionists like Joel Berry were very quick to amplify that Daily Mail article as quickly as possible. Berry not only shared the Daily Mail article, but also posted that after reading it, he said it's a miracle of restraint that Israel didn't just nuke Gaza off the face of the earth in response to October 7th. Now, what makes Berry's statement so disturbing is the reality of what Gaza actually was before this war. On October 7th, millions of people lived in the Gaza Strip prior to the massive destruction that Israel perpetuated, basically flattening that entire region into a parking lot. So when Joel Berry talks about restraint in the context of not nuking Gaza off the face of the earth, what he is effectively talking about is the annihilation of millions of people because of the actions of a extremely small group of terrorists. And honestly, it's insane to me that this sort of genocidal rhetoric has become normalized in parts of the media ecosystem and within segments of the right, because let's be honest about what is being implied here, okay? Berry is essentially arguing that the collective destruction of the Palestinian civilization in that region, in the Gaza Strip, would have been understandable or even justified considering the actions of Hamas on October 7th. Imagine that. Millions of people deserve to die because of a handful of terrorists. All that being said, what's equally important to point out in this situation is that it appears as though you can only make that statement in one direction. This kind of openly genocidal rhetoric is tolerated and in some circles even celebrated when it's framed as defending Israel. But the reverse is never tolerated under any circumstances. And look, to be clear, it should not be tolerated in either direction. But if someone on the pro-Palestinian side were to make an inverted version of the exact same statement Berry made, implying that mass violence against Israeli civilians was justified or understandable, they would almost certainly be removed from social media platforms, publicly destroyed by the media, potentially lose employment opportunities, and possibly even face financial blacklisting and debanking. Anyway, folks, it is increasingly evident at this point that we live in an incredibly propagandized environment. Honestly, it feels almost impossible to escape propaganda no matter where you go nowadays. Every major institution, every media platform, every political ecosystem, even the movies, everything you go, it doesn't matter what you're going to consume. It is just saturated with narrative management slop. And the worst part is that most of the propaganda isn't even good. It's lazy, repetitive, emotionally manipulative garbage. It's basically like walking into an all-you-can-eat pizza buffet only to realize that everything being served is cardboard trash pretending to be food. That's genuinely what modern media consumption increasingly feels like. And I'll be honest, I've grown deeply dissatisfied with the modern media ecosystem because you turn. It feels like you're constantly being psychologically managed, emotionally manipulated, appealed to in some kind of way, or force-fed some weird political narrative you don't even want to accept in the first place. Whatever happened to actual storytelling? Whatever happened to cultural confidence? Whatever happened to genuine Americana? If I'm going to be propagandized at all, at least give me some John Hughes style classic Americana that promotes family, Christianity, community, beauty, nostalgia, and a sense of national identity. At least make it inspiring. Instead, what we have are these influential, so-called influential conservative figures who at one point ran some formerly respected satirical publications out here openly shilling for foreign governments and trying to emotionally blackmail Americans into supporting endless war narratives overseas. Seriously, what the hell happened to our culture? Can we just get America back for like a split second? Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.